Hello, Edward.
Good morning, sir. Have we met before? You seem slightly familiar.
You may not know me, Edward, but I think you know my family. My name's Hatt. Charlie Hatt.
That's it. I've seen you at Natford Station.
Yes, I've been there quite a few times over the last couple of weeks.
Have you started working for our railway, Mr. Hatt? The last I heard of you, you were running for Parliament.
That didn't quite work out, so I've gone back to my career as a presenter on television. I'm working on a new documentary series about the railways of Sodor.
Are you here to film my branch line?
Not exactly. We're still researching at the moment, and I think you can help.
I'll be happy to help, Mr. Hatt. What do you need to know about?
The Thin Clergyman.
The Thin Clergyman?
He was the gentleman who wrote those books about the railway, wasn't he?
That's right, Peter. We were all sad to learn of his passing in 1997.
As was I, Edward. You were the first to meet him, weren't you? I mean, you were the first engine he wrote about.
Well, yes. I'll need to shunt these coaches off the main line, Mr. Hatt, but then I'll be happy to answer your questions about the Thin Clergyman.
Thank you.
A few minutes later, Edward had shunted his coaches, and Peter was still waiting with his trucks. He couldn't head out onto the main line until his signal was clear.
So what do you want to know about the Thin Clergyman, Mr. Hatt?
I'm mainly interested in how his work, his books, affected the railway.
Well, it's quite a story. To be perfectly honest, we didn't really realise at first how beneficial those railway series stories would be. It took a little while for their impact to become clear.
Really? Those books did make you lot rather famous. I mean, even I had heard of you all the way over on the mainland. That's one of the main reasons I volunteered for the Strategic Steam Reserve project.
We know that now, Peter, but we didn't know that at the time. In fact, the publication sort of caught us by surprise. You see, we'd met the Thin Clergyman while he was researching his first book, but all of us were very busy back then, with the war and all going on in Europe. I'm afraid to say the Reverend and his research soon passed from our mind. At least, until about a week or so after VE Day.
How so, Edward?
Well, as you know, The 3 Railway Engines was published on May 12, 1945, 4 days after the war ended. While many troops stayed in Europe to maintain the peace, quite a lot of them were coming home and reuniting with their families around that time.
It had been a busy time for the North West Railway. Now that the hostilities in Europe were over, most of the troops and their equipment had to be brought back to England. Naturally, the engines were very busy indeed. One morning, about a week after the war had finished, Thomas was bringing a train from the harbour into the big station. The tank engine was well aware of the hopeful looks from the people waiting on the platform, all of whom were waiting for their loved ones to be brought in from one of the troop ships.
Thank you for bringing my daddy home, Gordon.
Thomas was slightly surprised. Although passengers did come up and look at the engines, they usually didn't talk to him and his friends directly, unless there was something wrong.
You're welcome. Wait, hold on. What did you call me?
Are you Edward then? He's the other blue engine.
Actually, my name is Thomas.
Thomas, but you're not in the book.
What book?
Thomas didn't get a reply, for at that moment a returning soldier stepped up to the young boy, who grinned.
Daddy!
With that, the reunited family walked away.
Driver, do you know what book that child was talking about?
Book? I'm afraid I didn't hear any of what he was saying, Thomas. Thomas didn't say anything more, but he was still puzzled. Thomas returned to the sheds later that evening, still wondering about his earlier conversation with the young boy.
Are you alright, Thomas? You look a little perturbed.
I'm just a little puzzled, Edward.
Thomas replied, and he recounted what the little boy had said.
Wasn't there a clergyman going around a month or 2 ago researching our railway? I do remember hearing something about him writing a book.
That's right. I remember him asking me about when I got stuck in that tunnel just down from Vickerstown.
So you got stuck, did you, Henry? You mean you stuck yourself in there?
At least I was actually put into the book. Obviously that child had no idea who you were at all.
That's hardly unusual. You know the passengers usually talk to our guards or the station staff, not us.
Yes, you being approached like that is quite unusual.
Is it? Percy asked. He rarely got close to the passengers, having only taken coaches on a handful of occasions.
Yes, but it might not mean anything. After all, these aren't exactly usual times. I mean, with all these soldiers coming back and all.
James did have a point, the other engines thought. But events would soon prove the Red Engine wrong. Early the next morning, Gordon was backing down to take the express. He looked over as Edward steamed into the station. The Blue Engine had a troop train in tow and was looking quite flustered.
Running late, Edward?
They had trouble with the troop ship at the harbour. With this weather and all that, I tried to make up as much time as I could.
Gordon looked closely at Edward, taking in the other engine's exhaustion and lack of path.
It looks like that may be getting a bit too much for you, old Edward. Perhaps you better retire to a museum.
You're a rude train.
Excuse me?
You're rude to Edward. He helped you pull some trucks up the hill, and you didn't even say thank you. Now he's brought my daddy home, and you're being rude again.
Gordon was speechless.
Come on, we better find your father.
The boy's mother quickly dragged him away before Gordon could reply.
Well, I never. How did he? It must be in that book.
Before Edward could reply, Gordon departed. As usual, Gordon's run up to Barrow took him most of the day. He returned to the sheds around afternoon tea time. He stopped at the water tower to have a drink before heading out on the evening run.
Did you get it, driver?
Indeed, Gordon, replied Gordon's driver. He pulled a small book out of his pocket. While the big engine's fireman filled his tender, his driver began reading.
Once upon a time, there was an engine named Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward.
By the time his driver had finished the second story, Gordon was frowning.
That's...
Rather accurate by the sound of it.
What? But...
Are you denying those events took place, Gordon?
Well, no. But... You're right, Edward. I cannot fault that book's author on accuracy. I suppose that boy at the station had a point too.
Thank you,
Edward replied. With that, Gordon headed off to take his next train. As time went on, work on the railway returned to normal. The war was over and life carried on. But it didn't carry on quite the same as it had before. More and more often, the engines found themselves engaged in conversation with passengers, who asked them about the railway and their work. One morning, early in the spring of 1946, Thomas and Percy were getting ready for the day's work.
You know, I wouldn't have minded being in that book as well.
But aren't the passengers approaching you too? I mean, I've seen you talking to some of them when I've gone past.
Well, yes. But they mainly ask about who I am. They don't know me like they know the others.
It's not fair on the rest of us. Those 3 get the lion's share of the attention.
Thomas and Percy exchanged a look.
Yep, here we go again.
You've been asking if the Thin Clergyman's going to be writing another book again, haven't you?
Yes. There's more than 3 engines on this railway, you know.
Yes, but the Reverend can't tell all our stories all at once, surely. I mean, a book like that would end up the size of a phone book. That would be a bit hard to carry around and read.
A mischievous look crossed Thomas's face.
You mean you want a book about you, don't you, James?
Well, a splendid red engine like me does deserve one.
Really? I suppose it could include that time you had to fix your brake pipe with bootlaces?
Or the time you damaged the fat director's hat?
That's not what I meant.
Really? Those are stories about you.
James was cross, but before he could reply, another voice spoke. That's enough of that, Thomas and Percy. All 3 engines looked over to to see that the Fat Director had arrived. To answer the question you've been asking me over the last few months, James, the Thin Clergyman will be writing another book.
I'm glad to hear it.
About Thomas and how he got his branch line.
What?
Thomas and Percy laughed.
Oh, don't worry, James. You'll be in it. Remember your first day here?
Well, yes, but...
Does the Thin Clergyman want to talk to me about this new book?
Indeed, he'll be coming to see you next week. Grinning broadly, Thomas chuffed off.
As you know, Mr. Hatt, the rest is history.
Indeed.
Are you talking about those Railway Series books?
Asked James, who had arrived while Edward had been talking.
That's right. Mr. Hatt here asked about them for a documentary he's making.
James looked closely at the TV host.
I see. I hope you're planning to devote a full episode of this documentary series to the Thin Clergyman, Mr. Hatt. That is the very least he deserves.
Indeed. He and his family have done a lot for the railway.
It certainly sounds like it.
A moment later, the signal changed and Peter's road was clear. With a polite blast of his whistle, the heavy goods engine got his train underway. As he headed along the line, Peter found himself thinking about the Thin Clergyman. As he'd said, he had heard that name quite a few times, but hadn't really understood the significance of it. Peter found himself growing curious. He'd noticed how James had been speaking of the Thin Clergyman. It was rare for the Red Engine to speak that respectfully of anyone. Night had fallen by the time Peter finished his run.
Evening all?
Evening, Peter. Had a good rundown.
Indeed, and quite an interesting one too.
Oh, how so?
Do you know, Charlie Hatt is making a series of documentaries about the railways here.
The Fat Controller's brother? Does he want to film us?
I guess so.
You guess so? If he's making a documentary about the railway, surely he must want to film it.
Yes, but he wasn't asking about that. He was asking Edward about the Thin Clergyman and the impact his books have had on the railway.
Peter replied, and he recounted what James and Edward had said.
You know, it wasn't just here that those stories had an impact.
The other engines looked over at Sheffield. Do you mean that seeing your story published gave you a new perspective?
No, I was already on the Heritage Railway when Wilbert the Forest Engine was published. What I mean is that the Railway Series books help bring people to Heritage Railways, and so help them keep going. You see, we had these events where one or two of us would be painted up to look like some of you lot. Maxwell, our Black Five, was sometimes done up as you, Henry. I also played the role of Percy once or twice.
Did they really do that?
Oh, yes. It brought in lots of families whose kids wanted to see Thomas and his friends. Not everyone could come to Sodor, you know. Think of it like that time you lot went to the mainland after the Fat Controller got that special letter.
Well, I suppose that's alright then.
An awkward silence fell for a moment.
Devo, what did you say a few moments ago? Something about a new perspective?
Oh yes. As you know, I was rather misguided on my first visit here.
Indeed.
When I was sent back to the other railway, I still thought my actions were justified. A few months after that, Duck and the Diesel Engine was published. Once I found out I was in it, I asked my driver to get a copy. I can't fault the Thin Clergyman. His recount of those events was well researched and quite factual. But to hear those facts as though I were an outsider, well...
It gave you something to think about?
Well, yes.
We'll have to tell Mr. Hatt about this too. I'm sure it would be useful for his documentary.
Certainly sounds like it. Anyway, I must be off.
With that, Henry departed to pick up the flying kipper at the harbour. As he headed off, the Green Engine found himself lost in thought. All this talk of the Thin Clergyman's books had reminded him of something else. Something he would have to bring to the Fat Controller's attention. The next morning, Henry was getting ready for one of his usual passenger trains. As he backed down onto the coaches, he looked down the platform.
Excuse me, Miss Hatt.
The Fat Controller strode over.
What's up, Henry?
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Mom, but your brother's research prompted a bit of discussion in the sheds last night.
Charlie's research?
About the Thin Clergyman, Mom. After hearing some stories regarding his books, I found myself lost in thought.
Was it unfamiliar territory, Henry?
No, Thomas, it was very familiar territory indeed. I was contemplating how our railway may have ended up a lot smaller were it not for the railway series. You may have even lost your branch line.
Thomas and the Fat Controller exchanged a puzzled look.
What do you mean, Henry?
I'm talking about the Beeching Axe. Dr. Beeching came here.
Dr. Beeching came here? To Sodor?
Yes, he was investigating our railways for his, report.
That doesn't surprise me. The directors in London did try to throw their weight around, even though we're supposed to be operating independently.
I witnessed a discussion between him and Sir Charles Hatt, right here at Knapford, one morning in 1961.
Henry paused and thought back. That morning, Henry had been bringing his train to Platform 1 at the big station. As he came alongside, he caught sight of Sir Charles Topham Hatt standing outside his office with another man. It was clear that he was quite angry. What I'm saying, Dr. Beeching, is that you can't measure the value of a branch line by money alone. I've told you about the Reverend's books. Yes, some children's stories. Written from events on this railway, and accurately, too. Thanks to these books, we have hundreds of visitors each year, to all parts of our railway. If you take a look at those ledgers you value so much, you'll see that we return a profit year after year. You're saying that's due to these books? Mostly, yes. Closing the Farquhar line, or any other branch for that matter, will reduce that attraction. Consider the rest of the island as well, Dr. Beeching. Many of the towns along these branch lines rely on the railway for support and transport. I see. I'll take your points into account, Mr. Hatt. Thank you for your time. With that, Beeching strode over to one of Henry's coaches and climbed aboard. Henry looked over, worried.
Sir, what was that about closures?
That gentleman is preparing a report for the directors in London, recommending which lines and services should be cut to reduce costs.
I see.
It may be best if you don't mention this to the others, Henry. If we're to keep our lines open, we need to keep running as best we can. A drop in morale, right now, is the last thing we need.
I understand, sir. As you can imagine, I was rather worried. But our report only made one recommendation for the northwest region of British Railways, as we were at the time.
What was that?
Oh, just to close the Normanby branch line. Hadn't really been seeing much traffic since the Second World War.
Why was that?
Oh, the old harbour there was bombed during the war. It wasn't rebuilt afterwards.
Oh, I see.
Henry, why haven't you mentioned Dr. Beeching's visit before?
Your grandfather did ask me to keep it quiet, Miss Hatt. It's only last night that I thought to mention it. But there is something I must ask.
Go ahead.
Given all that the Thin Clergyman did for this railway, are you planning to do some sort of tribute?
That's a splendid idea, Henry. Ma'am, I'll be happy to help with this any way I can.
I'll second that, Thomas.
As it happens, I did have something planned.
Really? What sort of something?
June 15th this year would be the Thin Clergyman's 100th birthday where he's still alive. A celebration of that anniversary would be the least we could do.
The very least, Mom.
Exactly, Henry. I'll arrange something special.
Henry couldn't help wondering what the Fat Controller would arrange. Knowing Emily Hatt, he thought, it would indeed be something special. Word of this soon spread amongst the engines, and speculation was rife, at least for the next few weeks. But as time passed, the engine's attention turned to other matters. Pip and Emma arrived to look after the express, and Charlie Hatt continued his research. The final dedicated post trains were run, and motor rail service was started on the Normanby branch. Then, one Sunday morning, the Fat Controller called a meeting of the engines at Knapford. Not all could attend, but most of the North West Railway's lines were represented.
I'm sure you've all heard of the Thin Clergyman. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago. But as some of you may know, he was born 100 years ago this year. To mark this auspicious occasion...
What's auspicious?
Percy whispered to Henry. He'd hoped the Fat Controller hadn't hurt him, but she had.
Auspicious means important, Percy. To mark this important occasion, I have arranged for a portrait of the Thin Clergyman to be unveiled here in just over a week. Your schedules will be adjusted so that you can all attend. There will be a very special visitor here to perform the unveiling.
Who will that be, Mom?
Wait and see, Thomas. No spoilers.
A few days later, James arrived at Barrow-in-Furness. He was completing one of his regular goods runs, but his return journey would be anything but regular. The Thin Clergyman's portrait had arrived from the other railway, and he was to take it back to Knapford. As he pulled into the yard, the red engine glanced over at the North West Railway's station pilot.
Caden, where did you put the Thin Clergyman's portrait?
Caden looked over, puzzled.
The what?
The special load for the Fat Controller. It should be in a box van.
Ah, yes. About time you showed up to collect that. I've had to shunt around it all morning.
James frowned angrily.
Show some respect. The man represented in that portrait has done more for this railway than you could imagine.
Caden just glared at James.
It's on track 2.
James looked over, spotting a cushioned ride box van in amongst some other trucks. He then glanced at another siding, a few tracks over.
Couldn't you have just left it on track 5? It would have been out of the way there.
Don't tell me how to do my job.
Fine. Just let me shunt that box van onto the front of my train and I'll be on my way.
The rest of your trucks are on track 4. And make sure you put the other trucks back where you found them.
Of course. What else do you think I'd do with them?
James steamed off before Caden had a chance to reply. After turning around, James carefully shunted the box van onto the head of his train. Just as he finished, Peter arrived with one of his trains.
Morning, James.
Morning.
Are you all right, James? If you don't mind me asking. You look rather put out.
It's that Caden,
James said, and he explained what had happened earlier.
He does like to be in charge.
That was the least of it. He was acting as though the portrait was some sort of obstacle to shunt around. Does he have no idea?
I see. Still, the Fat Controller did trust him to shunt it, just as she's trusting you to deliver it safely to Knapford.
Yes, but even so, he listens to you, doesn't he?
Caden? Yeah, you could put it like that. I'll have a word with him.
Satisfied, James headed off. A few minutes later, Caden arrived.
Caden, can I have a word, please?
This won't interfere. Oh, hello, Peter. I didn't realise you'd arrived.
You thought I was James.
Well, he was just here. Oh, you should have heard the fuss he kicked up about that special load.
From what I've heard, there was fault on both sides.
Special loads are nothing but a bother, Peter.
I know you feel like that, Caden, but this one does have a special significance for all the engines on our railway. Even you. You see, a few months ago I learned about the Thin Clergyman and exactly what he means to our railway.
Peter began, and he started teaching the diesel what he'd learnt from the other engines. While Peter was telling Caden what he'd learnt, James was making good time along the main line. He'd quickly gotten over Caden's rudeness, and was grinning proudly as he chuffed along. Everything was going well, until James reached Henry's tunnel. Just as he cleared it, there was a loud rumble, then an almighty crash. James's driver looked back in alarm, and applied the brakes.
Driver, what happened?
2 of the tunnels have collapsed, James. The line's blocked.
We'll have to raise the alarm.
I've just tried my phone. Seems we're in a bit of a dead spot here. Before James could reply, a whistle sounded out through the 3rd tunnel. It was Alice, with the branch line flyer.
I heard a crash just as I entered the tunnel. Something hit the roof of my cab and my coaches too.
Then we do have a problem. The collapse of the other 2 tunnels must have destabilised that one.
What?
Alice looked back.
James? Patrick's coming the other way. We usually pass each other just down from here.
Guard!
I'm on it, replied the guard from James's train. He started running down the line, red flag in hand. James and Alice watched anxiously. They hoped Patrick would be able to stop in time. Sure enough, Patrick was heading along the line with one of his usual trains. He approached the tunnel, and suddenly everything seemed to happen at once.
Stop! Stop!
Stop! The tunnel's blocked!
What? Driver, brake! Quickly!
Patrick's driver quickly applied the brakes. The screech of steel on steel filled the air. Patrick braked for all he was worth. The other engines watched, helpless, as the diesel fought to avoid an almost certain derailment. James sighed with relief.
Phew. Are you alright, Patrick?
I think so, James. Just a bit shaken, though.
I can understand that.
With that, James headed off to complete his journey. As his train got underway, a worrying thought crossed his mind. With the tunnels blocked, the railway to the outside world was completely cut off. The signalman at the Ballyhoo Junction signal box had seen everything and had already raised the alarm. Once James, Alice and Patrick were clear, the Fat Controller sent Donald and Douglas to help repair the tunnel. Henry was already on the way with some workmen to assess the damage. The Scottish twins soon reached the tunnel and ran their eyes over the scene before them. The Fat Controller was near kidding when she said we were cut off. Aye, you can say that again. How's it looking, Henry?
Pretty bad. There's a lot of material to clear out before we can rebuild the tunnel.
We'd best get to work then.
I was thinking that one of you two could stay here to help the workmen. While that's being done, the other one of you and I could run trucks down to Crovan's Gate and back, clearing away the rubble.
Sounds like a plan, Henry. I'll stay here to help the workmen.
What was that plan?
Bear? Is that you?
I'm at the other end of the tunnel.
Who else is stuck up there?
Stephen, Pip and Emma, and Peter. Oh, and Caden.
If Ben and Peter could clear the tunnel from the other end, it would save a bit of time. That's what I was thinking, Donald, said the foreman of the work crew. He turned and shouted down the tunnel. Bear, I'll arrange for a work crew to join you and Peter. Can you clear the tunnel from that end?
It shouldn't be a problem.
With that, the High Mech departed to collect some trucks and tell Peter of the plan. He soon reached Barrow and stopped next to Peter.
How does it look?
Bad.
Bear replied, and he explained what the foreman had told him. Just as he finished, Caden arrived.
Bear, what are you doing with those trucks? Your train's on the other track.
It's a bit of an emergency, Caden. The Weckestone tunnel has collapsed.
What do you mean, collapsed?
I mean it's collapsed, Caden. Caved in, failed, fallen down. The raft support is resting on the tracks. It is an X-tunnel.
Peter chuckled, while Caden just looked annoyed.
But I know what collapsed means. But it can't collapse. I mean, trains have got to keep moving through my yard. I've got tracks to clear.
It can't be helped, Caden. Now Bear and I are going to be helping the workmen clear the tunnel from this end. We're going to need all the trucks we can get if we're to get this cleared up in time for the Thin Clergyman centenary.
By the Thin Clergyman centenary?
Yes. We can't let something like this prevent that tribute.
Remember what I was just telling you?
Ah, yes. I see. You still can't take those trucks, Bear.
Why not?
Because Shane's going to be picking them up soon. That's why. I have some empties that were due to go to Farquhar, though. You might as well use them instead.
With that, Caden headed off to fetch the trucks. News of the tunnel's collapse soon spread across the railway.
No engines can get onto the island either. Pip and Emma are stuck on the other side of the tunnel, and they're supposed to be bringing the important visitors.
That's for the Thin Clergyman's celebration, isn't it? Isn't that supposed to be this week?
This Wednesday, the 15th.
At least that gives us a couple of days to repair the tunnels.
Yes, I just hope it's enough time.
The other engines on Thomas's branch line were also worried.
I hope this doesn't interfere with the celebration plans. We've all got jobs to do on the day, but what if no one can get here?
Don't worry,
soothed Thomas's driver.
Bertie and his friends are meeting all the trains from the other railway and bringing the passengers over.
Thomas knew his driver had a point, but he still couldn't help feeling a bit worried. The Fat Controller had given orders to carry on as usual, but trains which were to have gone onto the other railway had to stop and reverse direction at Crovan's Gate.
So,
Does this mean you're an acting tank engine till the tunnel's repaired, Gordon?
Miss Hatt told us to maintain our regular schedules as best as we can. I'm sure an engine like you would understand, Reneus.
Ah, yes indeed.
Besides, this isn't the first time I've had to run like this.
A moment later, Gordon departed. For the rest of that day and most of the next, the engines worked hard. Henry, Bear, Peter and the Scottish twins worked non-stop, as did the workmen. All through the day and night they toiled, working to get the railway back up and running. The other engines worked hard too, doing whatever they could to help keep things moving. June 15th arrived, and the engines were still hard at work. Just before morning tea time, Pip and Emma arrived at Vickstown Station. Amongst their passengers were several VIPs, travelling to Napa for the unveiling of the Thin Clergyman's portrait.
I hope they're able to get the tunnel clear. So do I, Emma. We've still got a couple of hours though. Hopefully Bear and Peter will have cleared the tunnels.
I saw Bear taking some inspectors down there last night.
That sounds promising.
That's it. We just confirmed that the tunnels are clear and stable.
I'm glad to hear it. You've done a good job to get it done in time.
Thank you.
A few moments later, Pip and Emma were on their way. They eagerly brought their train up to speed, heading for the celebration of the Thin Clergyman. They were whistled and cheered by engines and people alike as they headed along the line. Both of the high-speed engines couldn't help grinning, not just because of the attention, but because they were relieved. Even as late as yesterday, the situation had looked pretty bleak. But now, it was clear that the celebrations for the Thin Clergyman's centenary were back on track. The Fat Controller was waiting to greet the VIPs, along with some local dignitaries. Pip and Emma smoothly pulled up next to the red carpet that had been laid out on the platform. The first person off the train was a prince, and the proper greetings were exchanged.
I trust your journey down went well, Your Highness.
Indeed, Miss Hatt. Your engines and railway provided a quite comfortable journey down.
I'm glad to hear it, sir.
I understand your engines and people have worked around the clock to ensure today would go smoothly.
We didn't want the Thin Clergyman's celebrations to be missed, Your Majesty.
Evidently not. With spirit like that, I can see why the Reverend decided to write his books about your railway.
Hearing this, one of the other VIPs, a children's author, looked over. He smiled warmly for a moment. Then, he joined the other special guests as they headed into the station for canapes and drinks. A couple of hours later, all the engines and guests had arrived. The prince made a short speech, then pulled a cord. The silk fell to the ground, revealing the portrait of the Thin Clergyman.
My parents read stories about your railways to me as a child. There will never be anything like it, anywhere.